All right, this is it. This is the last week.
Last week.
Week 10. Here's your checklist. We've got a couple reading assignments. You have your week 9 quiz and your final presentation. We can start today by checking out the outline of American literature, and we'll do a bit of an introduction to our final literary time period.
Thursday, you have right after our class, you start to have presentations, don't you?
Yes. Yes, your presentations are starting this week.
Are we still gonna have class Monday before the presentation?
You will not have class next Monday. So this Wednesday is your last class. All right, notice what it says here. We have chapters 7 and 8 are assigned. Notice the dates, right? 1945 to 1990. 1945 to 1990. It's split between poetry and prose. What is prose?
Just written language.
Just ordinary language, okay? So they split it between poetry and prose. So like prose is your novels and your short stories and things like that. But we have dates, 1945 to 1990. We know that our last period, what do we call our last period? Modernism. It was after realism, right? After realism was modernism. That was, what were our dates for modernism?
1914 to 1944.
45, yep. 1914 to 1945 was modernism. Right, we had the World War I and World War II framing that particular literary time period. So the last one we're going to study is called, does anybody know? After modernism is...
Pre-modern?
No? That would go before, right? So, yeah, post, that's it. Postmodernism. Postmodernism.
Well, it depends on what year you're thinking of.
That's going to be our last time period, is
We probably
postmodernism.
consider that a date now.
Now, if you look in your Norton textbook, I lost the page. This is week 10.
Yeah, I keep looking for it on Mondays, but not having enough till I get to class.
If you look in the Norton textbook on page 2305, what does the Norton Anthology give us for dates?
Since 1945.
Since 1945 to the publication of the anthology. So it doesn't really delineate in the 1990s as an end date. We can go with either one. 1945 to 1990 is fine for us. But notice the outline of American literature, after that there is a chapter 9 and chapter 10, and it just calls it contemporary. Contemporary means like with the times, like so current literature. But the Norton Anthology doesn't really delineate between postmodernism and contemporary. So
Get into Stephen King or something?
no, we're not going to get into well, Stephen King wrote some of his stuff before 1990, so I suppose he could be.
Some of his movies came out in the 80s,
So he could be postmodern. He could work. I don't think we have any selections that we're going to read in the book for Stephen King.
One of the better writers.
He's a very good writer. So let's look at what the outline says characterizes postmodernism. Maybe y'all could tell me before we even look at it, what characterizes literature and arts from 1945 to 1990? Just think about culture. And
Movies.
you weren't born yet? You weren't born before 1990? 92?
The movement.
What movement?
60s, 70s.
Okay, so you've got the 60s civil rights movement, you've got hippies. Good, that definitely influenced the literature, right? Can you think about any ways that may have...
Free love and all them free drugs.
Okay, free love, free drugs, experimentation, rock and roll, for sure. That definitely, all these things influence culture, right? And if it influences culture, it makes its way into the literature, right? Anything else y'all can think of?
Vietnam War.
Vietnam War was
Korean War.
a major thing. Korean War, the Cold War
Cold War.
was a major
60s
factor.
to the 80s.
Mm-hmm. Good. Well, see, y'all are familiar with some of the events. Even if you weren't born yet, you're still familiar with some of those events, right? 1990, right around there.
Right after, yeah, right
Mhm.
after that. Yeah, it was during the 1990s.
Let me see if I can find anything, any notes that I have.
And Beirut, and Libya, and
All right, from this particular chapter,
Me and this kind of moved a good influence on life.
okay, this is prose, so this is not our poetry. This is probably a better one to start with here. It says, narrative in the decades following World War II resists generalization. It was extremely various and multifaceted. It was vitalized by international currents such as European existentialism and Latin American magical realism, while the electronic era brought the global village. The spoken word on television gave new life to oral tradition. That's pretty interesting.
TV.
Right? You have television, right? The
Of
rise
course.
of television. TVs, and pretty much every single person in America had a television in their house throughout this time period.
They have more than one.
But very likely they have more than one. So it says that gave new life to the oral tradition. So it's almost like America went back to that time with the Native Americans where stories were told orally rather than written, right? You know, people were probably more likely to sit in front of their television at night than sit around the fireplace reading books, right?
Sit around the table.
So in a way with the electronic era, you have television bringing people back to this oral tradition. I think that's pretty interesting. This is pretty interesting too. In the past, elite culture influenced popular culture through its status and example. All right, so what that means is the authors in the past would write these books and people would read them, and that would make its way into pop culture. Right? So whatever the authors were writing about would make its way into pop culture. So if they were writing about characters, you know, rebelling against some system, okay, then the pop culture would adapt that and adopt that into their own practices. So you had like the authors were influencing pop culture. But it says during this period the reverse seems to have happened. Okay, serious novelists like Pynchon, Oates, Vonnegut, Walker, and Doctorow borrowed from and commented on comics, movies, fashion, songs, and oral history. So you have, it's like the opposite. You've got pop culture making its way into the literature instead. So it kind of reversed.
If they wanted to make money, they had to do it with stuff people were familiar with.
Yep, that's right. Writers became highly innovative and self-aware or reflexive. Often they found traditional modes ineffective and sought vitality in more widely popular material. To put it another way, American writers in the post-war decades developed a postmodern sensibility. Modernist restructurings of the point of view no longer sufficed for them. Rather, the context of vision had to be made new. All right, so the legacy... Yeah, well, and that's why it talks about up here the electronic era. So electronic era, yes, it was very important, the beginnings of computers and data systems. I would say after 1990 you have, you know, the internet becoming more widely popular, so that's what would maybe catapult us into a whole new literary time period. You know, some might call it like the information age or the digital age or something like that. So if you wanted to relabel it instead of, you know, contemporary literature, like the outline calls it, you know, eventually when people are ready to start putting labels on it, it probably will be the information age or the digital age or something like that, computer age. But it's interesting to think about how today's literature is shaped by, you know, computers and culture and arts. Yeah, definitely, sometimes in negative ways. Let's look at the other chapter for this.
It's weird how long we can go back to the 80s to come up with any ideas.
Maybe they're not just good enough so we can make more visual, but they're just.
Well, I just noticed the last few years about 5 or 6 movies every year that comes out are from the 80s.
Mhm. All right, American poetry, postmodern poetry. It says traditional forms and ideas no longer seem to provide meaning to many American poets in the second half of the 20th century. Events after World War II produced for many writers a sense of history as discontinuous, Each act, emotion, and moment was seen as unique. Style and form now seemed provisional, makeshift, reflexive of the process of composition and of the writer's self-awareness. Familiar categories of expression were suspect. Originality was becoming a new tradition. All right, so we talked about style and form. Remember during our last period, during modernism, style and form were really important. The focus was on style and form, right? How can we do this? How can we tell a story? Not what story are we going to tell. It was how are we going to tell it in a different way. So this kind of continues. It's still important. It says it becomes more reflexive of the process of composition. So it wasn't necessarily the main focus, but it was still important. You know, the people that came, yeah, style and form, how they were going to create the work was still very important, but it wasn't necessarily as important as the previous period. Break from tradition. We said modernism represented a sharp break from the past. So this is still continuing throughout this time period, and it says it gathered momentum during the 1957 obscenity trial of Allen Ginsberg's poem Howl. This particular trial and this particular piece of literature reshaped the way Americans viewed culture, and it reshaped how the arts would infiltrate American society. Did anybody read that poem yet? That's on the reading list for this week. Howl.
Well, we didn't know it until this morning.
No, all the readings are posted for the semester. Yeah. They've been posted for the whole semester in lessons. All right, if you haven't seen Howl, let's take a look at it right now. See if I can find the page number for you.
See, everyone there and we came with there so much.
I know, but I have all the readings are all listed. Mm-hmm. Page 2590 or thereabouts is going to be Howl. You might want to flip to that. 2590. All right, Allen Ginsberg, he was one of the beat poets. That was a school of poetry during this period. And I suppose this little introductory information is pretty good. It says, in the author's own words, the poem is an affirmation of individual experience of God, sex, drugs, absurdity, etc. Part 1, this poem is divided into, I think, 3 parts. Part 1 deals sympathetically with individual cases. Part 2 describes and rejects the Moloch of society, which confounds and suppresses individual experience and forces the individual to consider himself mad if he does not reject his own deepest senses. Part 3 is an expression of sympathy and identification with Carl Solomon, who is in the madhouse, saying that his madness basically his rebellion against Moloch, and I am with him, and extending my hand in union. This is an affirmative act of mercy and compassion, which are the basic emotions of the poem. The criticism is that society is merciless. All right, so we're going to listen to a little bit of part 1. But what happened was, this poem, after it was written, a lot of people read it or heard about it, maybe didn't even read it, and they were very offended by the content of the poem. Think about 1957. America in 1957, what did it look like? It was what?
It started with wild.
In 1957, in the 50s?
No, it was structured. Women were told
Long
what.
legs, greasing the hair.
That was the,
Oh, Fonzie?
no, I was thinking more like Leave It to Beaver.
This is what I think of when I think of the 1950s. Mainstream America, right? This is the picture of the ideal American family, right? So you're right. You do have the start of rock and roll. You do have the greasers and things like that coming about too. But if we're talking mainstream, this is the ideal picture of an American family. What's that? Mom and pop. There you go. All right. So how would this particular family receive Allen Ginsberg's poem is what you need to think about as we listen to it. Probably not. And they would probably go a step further, and they did, and they challenged it, and they tried to censor the poem. They tried to keep it off the shelves. They tried to make it basically illegal. All right, so this is one of the first times you have a major trial related to a piece of literature in America.
Guess who's one that started that program?
Who was it?
One of those rock and roll still today.
Who was it? Really? He was in there? It's an interesting start for him. All right, so let's listen to some of Allen Ginsberg's poem. You can read along if you want. Was it 2590?
2592.
2592? Okay. All right, so if you want to read along, the poem was inspired by his friend Carl Solomon, who, like it says here in the introductory material, it was someone he met in a psychiatric institute, someone that had been labeled as crazy. So Ginsberg did spend some time with Carl Solomon, and he was one of the inspirations for the poem. And he's going to basically talk about the America that he sees and the people that he sees. So he doesn't see the Leave It to Beaver family. He doesn't see mainstream America. He sees something completely different.
Was he like the guy that starts the 60s or something?
You said that you met him at
Psychiatric Institute, mental hospital.
a, so what was he there?
Crazy too?
Yeah,
He was crazy,
yeah,
too.
I suppose.
Were you there visiting somebody?
No, I think he was in there. I think he was committed for a period of time. I believe so.
3 years.
He's a very interesting guy. All right, so let's listen to Ginsberg. And I'll tell you what, the first time I saw a video or a picture of Ginsberg, it did not look like the person I thought it was going to be. So I read his literature first before I had seen a picture of him or heard his voice. It was just totally different from what I expected. But. All right, here's Ginsberg, hopefully, reading his poem.
Howl for Carl Solomon. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn looking for an angry fix. Angel-headed hipsters burning for the ancient heavenly connection to the starry dynamo and the machinery of night, who poverty and tatters and hollow-eyed and high sat up smoking in the supernatural darkness of cold water flats, floating across the tops of cities contemplating jazz, who bared their brains to heaven under the L and saw Mohammedan angels staggering on tenement roofs illuminated, who passed through universities with radiant, cool eyes hallucinating Arkansas and Blake light tragedy among the scholars of war, who were expelled from the academies for crazy and publishing obscene odes on the windows of the skull, who cowered in unshaven rooms in underwear, burning their money in wastebaskets and listening to the terror through the wall, who got busted in their pubic beards returning through Laredo with a belt of marijuana for New York, who ate fire in paint hotels or drank turpentine in Paradise Alley death, or purgatoried their torsos night after night with dreams, with drugs, with waking nightmares, alcohol and cock and endless balls, incomparable blind streets of shuddering cloud and lightning in the mind leaping toward poles of Canada and Patterson, illuminating all the motionless world of time between peyote solidities of halls, backyard green trees, cemetery dawns, wine drunkenness over the rooftops, storefront boroughs of tea-head joyride, neon, blinking traffic light, sun and moon and tree vibrations in the roaring winter dusks of Brooklyn, ashcan rantings and kind king light of mind, who chained themselves to subways for the endless ride from Battery to Holy Bronx on Benzedrine, until the noise of wheels and children brought them down, shuddering, mouth-racked and battered, bleak of brain, all drained of brilliance in the drear light of zoo, who sank all night in submarine light of Bickfords, floated out and sat through the stale beer afternoon in desolate Fugazis, listening to the crack of doom on the hydrogen jukebox, who talked continuously 70 hours from park to pad to bar to Bellevue to museum to the Brooklyn Bridge, a lost battalion of platonic conversationalists jumping down the stoops, off fire escapes, off window sills, off Empire State, out of the moon. Yakety-yakking, screaming, vomiting, whispering facts and memories and anecdotes and eyeball kicks and shocks of hospitals and jails and wars. Whole intellects disgorged in total recall for 7 days and nights with brilliant eyes. Meat for the synagogue cast on the pavement, who vanished into nowhere, Zen, New Jersey, leaving a trail of ambiguous picture postcards of Atlantic City Hall. Suffering eastern sweats and Tangerian bone grindings and migraines of China under junk withdrawal in Newark's bleak, furnished room, who wandered around and around at midnight in the railroad yard, wondering where to go, and went, leaving no broken hearts, who lit cigarettes in boxcars, racketing through snow toward lonesome farms and grandfather night, who studied Plotinus, Poe, St. John of the Cross, the Book of the Dead, telepathy, and Bach Kabbalah, because the cosmos instinctively vibrated at their feet in Kansas, who loaned it through the streets of Idaho, seeking visionary Indian angels who were visionary Indian angels, who thought they were only mad when Baltimore gleamed in supernatural ecstasy, who jumped in limousines with the Chinamen of Oklahoma on the impulse of winter, midnight, streetlight, small town, rain, who lounged hungry and lonesome through Houston seeking jazz or sex or soup, and followed the brilliant Spaniard to converse about America and eternity, a hopeless task, and so took ship to Africa, who disappeared into the volcanoes of Mexico, leaving behind nothing but the shadow of dungarees and the lava and ash of poetry scattered in fireplace Chicago, who reappeared on the West Coast investigating the FBI in beards and shorts with big pacifist eyes, sexy in their dark skin, passing out incomprehensible leaflets, who burned cigarette holes in their arms, protesting the narcotic tobacco haze of capitalism, who distributed super communist pamphlets in Union Square, weeping and undressing while the sirens of Los Alamos wailed them down and wailed down Wall, and the Staten Island ferry also wailed, who broke down crying in white gymnasiums, naked and trembling before the machinery of other skeletons, who bit detectives in the neck and shrieked with delight in police cars for committing no crime but their own wild cooking, pederasty, and intoxication, who howled on their knees in the subway and were dragged off the roof waving genitals and manuscripts, who let themselves be fucked in the ass by saintly motorcyclists and screamed with joy, who blew and were blown by those human seraphim, the sailors, caresses of Atlantic and Caribbean love, who bawled in the morning and the evenings in rose gardens and the grass of public parks and cemeteries, scattering their semen freely to whomever come who may, who hiccuped endlessly trying to giggle but wound up with a sob behind a partition in a Turkish bath when the blonde and naked angel came to pierce them with a sword, who lost their love boys to the three old shrews of fate, the one-eyed shrew of the heterosexual dollar, the one-eyed shrew that winks out of the womb, and the one-eyed shrew that does nothing but sit on her ass and snip the intellectual golden threads of the craftsman's loom, who copulated ecstatic and insatiate with a bottle of beer, a sweetheart, a package of cigarettes, a candle, and fell off the bed, and continued along the floor and down the hall and ended fainting on the wall with a vision of ultimate cunt and cum eluding the last schism of consciousness, who sweetened the snatches of a million girls trembling in the sunset and were red-eyed in the morning but prepared to sweeten the snatch of the sunrise, flashing buttocks under barns and naked in the lake, who went out whoring through Colorado in myriad stolen night cars, Neil Cassidy, secret hero of these poems, joy to the memory of his innumerable lays of girls themselves in empty lots and diner backyards, Coxman and Adonis of Denver, movie houses, rickety rows, on mountaintops, in caves, or with gaunt waitresses in familiar roadside, lonely petticoat upliftings, and especially secret gas station solipsisms of jobs and hometown alleyways, too, who faded out in vast sordid movies, were shifted in dreams, woke on a sudden Manhattan, and picked themselves up out of basements hung over with heartless Tokay and horrors of Third Avenue iron dreams, and stumbled to unemployment offices, who walked all night with their shoes full of blood on the snowbank docks, waiting for a door in the East River to open to a room full of steam, heat, and opium, who created great suicidal dramas on the apartment cliff banks of the Hudson under the wartime blue floodlight of the moon, and their heads shall be crowned with laurel in oblivion, who ate the lamb stew of the imagination or digested the crab at the muddy bottom of the rivers of Bowery, who wept at the romance of the streets with their push carts full of onions and bad music, who sat in boxes breathing in darkness under the bridge and rose up to build harpsichords in their lofts, who coughed on the 6th floor of Harlem, crowned with flame under the tubercular sky surrounded by orange crates of theology, who scribbled all night rocking and rolling over lofty incantations which in the yellow morning were stanzas of gibberish, who cooked rotten animals' lung, heart, feet, tail, borscht and tortillas dream.
All right, that's the end of the recording. It keeps going for a couple of pages, but what's your reaction to that?
Sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Sex, drugs, and rock and roll, that's what you get from it?
Go to bed. Be 10 foot pool line, I want that to be.
What's that?
How many pounds he does that still?
Right, right. So why does he do that? Repetition is it's an element of poetry, right? Repetition is it's a musical element. It gives a sound quality to a poem. It's also a rhetorical strategy. If you read the Declaration of Independence, it's also very repetitive. It says he did this, he did that, and it's referring to the King of England. So it makes a point. In this case, who are all these who's? In this poem?
Oh, this one?
People. These are people that he knew or people that he saw. And he's saying, like, these are the people and this is what they did. And if you'll notice, he goes throughout America. He talks about the Midwest, the East Coast, the West Coast. He's saying it's everywhere.
In all religions, he mentioned
A lot of drugs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are references. Mm-hmm. So references to many different religions. Good.
It reminds me of
Of who?
John. Reminds me of John.
Chong, just looking at him, the picture.
And the way he speaks.
Okay. Yeah.
I was thinking he sounds like yeah, there's John.
Mm-hmm.
He sounds like he smoked a lot too.
Hey, you guys asked about how he ended up in the mental institute. It says he eventually finished Columbia University in 1948 with high grades, but under a legal cloud. Herbert Hunke, a colorful but irresponsible addict friend, had been using Ginsberg's apartment as a storage depot for the goods he stole to support his drug habit. To avoid prosecution as an accomplice, Ginsberg had to plead insanity and spent 8 months in the Columbia Psychiatric Institute. 8 months. So if you weren't crazy going in, I'll bet after 8 months in there, you probably were a little bit crazy.
It sounds like in his poem he was already crazy. What do you
He
think?
talks about a lot in this poem. He's talking a lot about acid.
Mhm. Psychedelic drugs, opium, sure. So lots of drug references.
To know what they're in,
So
he
he
had to
probably-
try them himself.
Well, I know he probably got, back at that time, they used LSD in the psychiatry world to
Mhm.
treat the patients.
Mhm.
And that's probably where he got used to it and started.
That could be. Yeah, he could have seen,
They
experimentations.
didn't quit using LSD in the psychiatry world
Mhm.
until the 80s.
Okay. So that could have been definitely a link or a connection that he saw. But this world, this America that he paints in this poem is not the Leave It to Beaver world, right? And that's the problem. It challenged the mainstream idea, the ideal America that, you know, people were after, or people believe existed, or people were trying to portray. You know, so these were real people that he's discussing in his poem, but these are people that society was trying to ignore, you know, trying to pretend like they didn't exist.
Parts of the city that nobody wants.
Right. He's talking about the parts of the city that were ignored too. Right.
Like the Bronx and Chicago,
Mhm.
especially during that time, I mean, you talked about the cops, during cops.
Mhm.
They were using riots.
Mhm.
Plus, you know, you gotta think about, Al Capone during that time.
Mhm.
It's
This is
about
probably a little
money.
bit after
There's a lot-
that, but there's still a lot of
Al Capone was
corruption.
in the 30s.
There's a lot,
Sure.
especially in the,
What you
was
said.
it in the sixties, where they had a lot of,
60s, 70s,
hoarding, a
80s.
lot of drugs, it was very,
Mhm.
there was a movie I saw that had to do with mafia, they're transferring a lot of drugs from Colombia, showing all of how famous the town
Mhm.
and stuff like that.
That's cool.
The movie Blow with Johnny Depp
Yeah.
goes through that.
Somehow,
Mhm.
before that,
There's a bunch of them. If you're thinking of mafia, there's a bunch of mafia movies.
But as far as this poem goes, it's wildly different from things that we've read before, and it really did change America, because the outcome of the trial was that they couldn't censor it. You know, you can't censor free speech, and so he was using his constitutional right to free speech to say these things and to write these things. You know, they were trying to shut him down and say, no, you can't say that. That's obscene. That's, you know, that's not something
I
people.
love- That's what they tried to do to Larry Flint too.
Right. Yes.
how is he being, so this was a published, how was it available? How did they have access to it?
Let's see. It says in the Outline of American Literature, if I can find it. I know it was published, but I don't know exactly where it was published. Originally, anyway. I'm sure after it went to trial, it was published a whole lot more, just because it was now famous, and even the trial ended up having, I guess, the reverse, you know, reaction that they were going for, and became more popular. I don't know. I don't know where it was originally published.
How come Silent Howl?
Because he's howling through the whole dang thing.
Well, it's kind of like a, yeah, I mean, I guess you could say he's howling through the thing. He's, you know, if you think about a dog or a wolf howling at the moon, you know, he's just trying to get it out of him. I don't know. You could probably read some criticism of the poem, though, and see what experts say why he chose that title.
I think the howling comes from an owl supposed to be wise and
Mhm. Okay, that could be it. I don't know. I'm sure there are plenty of people that have written articles and essays about why he chose the title Howl.
Yeah, but he's a little slim to nothing compared to what Larry Flint done.
It says the charismatic Allen Ginsberg became the group's chief spokesperson. It's referring to the Beat Poets. The son of a poet father and eccentric mother, committed to communism. Ginsberg attended Columbia University, where he became fast friends with fellow students Kerouac and Burroughs, whose violent, nightmarish novels about the underworld of heroin addiction include The Naked Lunch. These three were the nucleus of the Beat movement. I thought it said more about this poem and when it was challenged in court.
late 60s, early 70s.
It says when the San Francisco Customs Office seized the book, its publisher, Lawrence Ferlinghetti's City Lights, brought a lawsuit. During that notorious court case, famous critics defended Howell's passionate social criticism on the basis of the poem's redeeming literary merit. Howell's triumph over the censors helped propel the rebellious Beat Poets, especially Ginsberg and his friends Jack Kerouac and William Burroughs, to fame. So that's all it really says here, but I'm sure there is plenty written about,
Like I
you know,
said,
the
just
trial.
lost the trial. People
There's an entire movie called Howl, and it's based on his life and the poem and his personal life, which is, I mean, kind of interesting. He was, you know, openly gay, well, somewhat openly gay in his own community. Well, it does.
From what he read here, it sounded like he was doing way too mean.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could read his literature that way. I mean, some of it's
Does he
understandable
see
though.
half of this stuff? He had to actually be involved in it.
Yeah, or heard about it. I mean, if you think about some of the literature we read, like Aluda Equiano, like was that really his autobiographical account, or was it more of a composite of stories he heard and knew about and just tried to turn it into one narrative? You know, that could be something similar here.
He would actually have to do it to just hear about it.
Or he had a good imagination. Or it was, like you said, a drug-induced imagination. Yeah.
Would it safe to say that a lot of the writers and stuff that we know to discuss, like Edgar Allan Poe,
It does seem like a lot of the famous authors and poets that we read had drug and alcohol addictions.
Well, even the greatest.
Not all of them, but a lot of them.
Unless their imagination will.
Yeah, there could be a relationship between the imagination and the use of the drugs and alcohol.
Well, I know most country singers did. Most
Yes.
great ones.
It could just be more of a commentary on America in general,
Or more.
as like many Americans have drug and alcohol problems. It might not just be, you know,
Well, but the ones
it
you
might not
hear
just be the
about
writers.
Are the ones that are famous.
Yeah.
And I know it really with Amy Mellon, rock and rollers.
Mm-hmm. All right, so we also have Flannery O'Connor. She's a Georgia author. Some of y'all may have read some of her stuff. That's a short story for this week. We have Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, just the first chapter, but that by itself, that one chapter kind of stands as almost like a short story in itself. So you don't even need to read the whole book to appreciate this first chapter. Sherman Alexie, this is one of my favorite stories to close this course with. It's Do Not Go Gentle. It's a short story too. And that's the only poem we read was Howl. If you're interested in censorship, if for some reason you use that as your topic for your presentation, do not miss Howl. That would be a good one to talk about, yeah, if you were doing censorship. And it really did change things. I mean, if it wouldn't have been Howl, you could say that somebody else may have come along and published something that riled people up and, you know, led to a big trial and, right.
He didn't just do it in writings, he did it full-blown pictures.
But that was long after Howl. So you could say that, you know, that obscenity trial for Howl may have paved the way for people like Larry Flint and other people that, you know, produce obscene works or challenged works. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he definitely was, you know, his grotesque writings definitely challenged people. I don't know how much blowback he got from society and how many people challenged his writings and said, no, that shouldn't be on the bookshelf. I mean, it may have happened or maybe not, I don't know. I just know that this is a very famous example. And you have to think, like, if the court decision went the other way, would America be a different place right now? Or would someone else have come along to eventually, you know, win the ability to write and say whatever they want?
Even if he would have lost stuff, all it did was help his reputation.
Yeah, well, so like they say with publicity, sometimes bad publicity is yeah, just as good as good publicity.
Like that was in the country song. Those are talking about it. I forget the name of the song.
All right, you have a quiz this week. I will talk more about what will be on your quiz, but I think it's heavily focused on Invisible Man. I believe your quiz is heavily focused on Invisible Man.
I thought it'd be on the house.
So we don't have time to really go through the other short stories. I did want to introduce you to Howl and talk about it. But, in the Norton Anthology, you have an introductory section on page 2305. And let me run through that real quick and see if I have notes for you on that. On 2305, it talks about what's called the post-war era. All right, so postmodernism is also referred to as the post-war era, and that's saying after World War I and World War II. So even though we still have wars during this time period, like the Cold War, the Vietnam War, Panama,
As
you
big
know,
as the war.
what's that?
It's not as big as
It's not as big as World War I and World War II. So when it says, when we're talking about the war, it's usually talking about World War II. So this is the post-war era for that reason. It talks about the change in society. You had minorities, specifically African Americans, going to war and coming back to the country wanting, equal rights because they were fighting for the country alongside, white men, and they wanted the same rights, African Americans. It talks about that on 2305 at the bottom. It says they were unwilling to return to second-class status, so that helped to propel the civil rights movement of the 60s. Right. Yeah, they were the same status as all the other soldiers. You were just a soldier. It wasn't you're a white soldier or a black soldier. You're an American soldier. So when they came back, they were no longer equal, and I think that really helped to propel that civil rights movement and drive them toward equality. What's that? African Americans? Not in our society. No, not when they got back from the war.
When did it become like equal?
Equal under the law? When I would say, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 or 65 is what gave them equality under the law. That doesn't mean they still received it, but legally at that point they were supposed to be equal. 1964, 65 was the Civil Rights Act.
Even though
And actually they just rolled back part of that a couple weeks ago. Part of the Civil Rights Act was the Voting Rights Act, which guaranteed, equal rights to vote. And the Supreme Court just overturned part of it, which is, for a lot of people, they see that as a very sad day. Page 2306, it talks about the wars, the Korean War, war in Vietnam. What happened was strategy with war changed in a major way, right? You went from these wars where people were actually killing hundreds of thousands of people to the Cold War, where nobody was fighting. It was still a war. It was these two sides building up their arsenals, but not firing any shots. That's why it was a Cold War instead of a hot war. So the strategy of war changed. And then it changed even further. If we're going by the Norton Anthology's definition here, American literature since 1945, which brings us to the present time, we go from these hot wars to the Cold War, and now war is completely different. Now it's these isolated cells that aren't even state-sponsored. So you can't say we're at war with Afghanistan. You can't necessarily say we were at war with Iraq. We're at war with these terrorist groups that happen to be in Afghanistan or happen to be in Iraq or happen to be in Yemen or wherever they might be, but that doesn't necessarily mean we're at war with Yemen or we're at war with Afghanistan.
We called them terrorists, but in reality, we were at one time.
Yeah, they say one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. So,
Well, at one time, America was a terrorist group.
well, typically terrorists
Against England.
terrorists will claim innocent lives, not soldiers' lives. So that's the difference between terrorism and just war.
But
The
the
world
same
looks at
about
us
it,
as a terrorist.
they just don't care about the
Well, and if one of our drones goes off in Yemen and kills innocent people, then
We do it a lot.
that could fit that definition of terrorism, right? I mean, it's
That's
killing
why we
innocent
take
civilians rather than soldiers. So, but anyway, the point is that the idea of war has changed throughout time, right? From when we used to line up in lines and fire volleys at the opposition to, World War I and World War II, where you have trench warfare, and then you have, the Cold War, where there's less fighting, but you have spy operations going on in different countries, to now we have these terrorist cells that we're basically at war with, a war against terrorism. Cyber war is the next one, right? So if you're talking about, what is our current literary time period, and it gets labeled as the digital age or something like that, war adapted too, right? And now it's cyber war, and we're hiring more people to attack other computers and protect our computers, and it's all about information. So,
Say information is the most important thing.
right. All right, so that's war on 2306. On 2308, it talks about the literary developments in the country. A couple lines down in that section on 2308, where it says literary developments, it says conflicts between conformity and individuality, tradition and innovation, stability, and disruption characterized the literature of the period. All right, so the conflicts there between conformity and individuality. If you go down a little bit further, it says cultural homogeneity was an ideal during the 1950s. Homogeneous, what does that mean? Everything the same, right? So the ideal in the 1950s was Leave It to Beaver. Okay, mom, dad, 2.5 kids, white picket fence. You know, dad works, mom stays home. That was the ideal America, right? Everybody was supposed to fit that same mold. And there's a reason for that. You had a huge explosion of the middle class in the 1950s. That's when the middle class was successful, the middle class grew. People were able to afford the house. They were able to afford for the mother to stay home. You know, divorce was not as rampant. All right, so that was an achievable ideal for a lot of people during that time. Not everyone, but for a lot of people. So that's how this period starts. If we're talking 1945 to 1990 or 1945 to current time, you've got the 50s at the beginning there, and that's how the period starts. But when you get to now, it's totally different, right? The book says, it's on page 2313 at the very bottom. A hallmark of the post-war period is its shift from unity to what? Diversity. All right, so the ideal American family went from Leave It to Beaver to maybe, how about this? All right, Leave It to Beaver to maybe this, right? You've got a gay couple, you've got Hispanic woman with the white guy with a child from a previous marriage. This is still kind of Leave It to Beaver-ish, but it shows you that, you know, America's branched out to this other idea of
And
what a
also,
family could be.
The women and the girls are wearing shorter clothes.
That's true. Yes. All right, does that make sense? So we went from Leave It to Beaver to this, right? Now you have diversity within families. You've got, you know, gay marriages. You've got so many different elements now. You know, there is no one single mold for a family anymore. All right, and that's what the book says. It says the hallmark of the post-war period is its shift from unity to diversity. All right, so Leave It to Beaver is unity, right? Everybody is about the same. Everybody dresses the same. Everybody, you know, lives in the suburbs. Now it's a different America, much different. I'm trying to see if there's anything I missed in this section. It does talk about Howell again on page 2310 if you're interested. It says he first delivered his poem aloud during a reading at Six Gallery in San Francisco in the fall of 1955. The following year it was published by Lawrence Ferlinghetti's City Lights Bookshop. Oh, it talks about deconstruction on 2311. That's an interesting idea. I don't know if that's going to be on your quiz or not, but deconstruction is it's a theory of literature. It's a literary theory of how to interpret literature, and it basically says that you cannot derive truth from literature. You can't derive truth from literature. Here's why. I'll give you an example. All right, so this is deconstruction. All right, deconstruction. Basically, it's saying deconstruction is saying you can't derive truth from literature because literature is made up of words and you can't derive truth from words. It's too difficult. All right, so in the past we said, no, you can derive truth from literature. You can derive this truth of, you know, what's right and what's wrong, like Huck Finn. You know, is it right to, you know, own a person or not? And the truth comes through in the literature that no, it's not, because here's what Huck says, here's what society told Huck. So people were able to gain universal truths, right? Things that apply to everyone at all times from literature, right? But the deconstructionists say, no, that's not the case, right? Because when you're dealing with words, there can be multiple meanings to words. All right, so if there can be multiple meanings, you can't count on one or another to be true. So like this one, all right, it says, time flies like arrows. I could say the concept of time moves quickly, right, because that's what flies means. Moves fast. Like or as an arrow does, right? An arrow from a bow and arrow.
An arrow doesn't do nothing
Well, if it was shot, right? So the concept of time moves fast just like an arrow from a bow and arrow does, right? Fair enough? Can we read that sentence that way? I could read it another way. Time, the verb. Take this stopwatch. There you go. Take that stopwatch. And I want you to time these flies, right, that are flying around the room, just like you would time an arrow that was shot from a bow. Does that make sense? You could read it that way, couldn't you? So I want you to time the flies that are buzzing around the room just like you would time an arrow shot from a bow and arrow. Okay, how about this? That's what deconstructionists do. They say, well, what does this word mean? What does that word mean?
Yeah.
How do these words act together? You could do it another way. You could say, all right, this right here, these are new types of flies right here, and we're going to call them time flies. That's the name of these little creatures right here. These are time flies. And guess what? They enjoy
Eating arrows.
arrows for some reason. They like them. They like to buzz around them, follow them around, land on them, eat them, whatever. Yeah, deconstructionists are, I think their basic point is just that you can't get truth out of literature because there are so many ways to read one sentence or one word. So if we can't make sense of this one sentence, if three of us could look at it three different ways based on the words themselves and what the words might mean with one sentence, if we can't gain any truth from that one sentence, how are we supposed to gain truth from an entire book or an entire poem if this one sentence could mean so many different things? So basically their conclusion is that you can't gain truth from literature, which I don't agree with. I think that's pretty bunk, but that's the idea behind it. It's a little bit different. It's a little bit different from that.
I just think literature is up to the individual interpretation.
Yeah, that's true. It is. I mean, that's why I try to tell people there are no right and wrong answers when it comes to literature, but there are better supported answers and weaker
Should we all
answers.
get 100s on tests then? Since there's no right or wrong?
No, because if I ask you a subjective question, which I typically don't, but if I do ask you a subjective question, I usually ask for, the best
I know, but you
the
just
best
said
possible
everybody
answer.
interpreted different.
They can, but find me a subjective question that I've asked that could be interpreted differently.
Well, maybe anything can be interpreted.
Okay.
When it
Well,
comes to literature.
you may have had one in your quiz last week, actually, dealing with symbols from the snows of Kilimanjaro.
Last day yesterday.
That's today's, right? It's due today. So there is a subjective one in there, and if you want to argue that one on Wednesday, I'd be glad to. We can talk about that one.